Hi everyone, this is Nicole Dyer, and this is the Research Like a Pro with DNA question and answer series. Today, our video is about how to create Ancestry custom clusters with an unknown DNA match. And this video will focus on how you can find clusters with unknown common ancestors that can help you find an ancestor in your tree that you haven't figured out yet. So if all of your custom clusters with known matches are just turning out more clusters with known ancestors, then try using an unknown match. So I'll walk you through the process, how to choose a match, and how to evaluate those clusters and figure out the common ancestors. Today I'm going to share a tip from lesson 6, which is about DNA tools, focusing on the tools that use genetic networks. So in the past, I've talked about Ancestry custom clusters. Today, I want to focus on starting with a match of interest that's an unknown match, meaning you don't know who the common ancestor is with the match yet. So before when I was first starting using custom clusters, I would start with a known match. And what I noticed is I was getting mostly known clusters, a lot of clusters where I could easily figure out the common ancestor because it was already an ancestral couple that I knew about. And usually in our genetic genealogy, we're looking for the parents of a known ancestor. So we need to find unknown clusters in order to figure out who they are. So to try this hypothesis here that if we start with an unknown match who's related to a known match, maybe we will get some unknown clusters to help us find those missing ancestors in our tree. So that's kind of the idea of this experiment today, to see if we can find unknown clusters. So here's kind of some steps for how to choose an unknown match. So we always need to start with a known match, and that helps us get on the right line of the family. But since we don't want to use a known match for the custom clusters, then we need to look in their shared matches to find somebody who's more distant, a little further back, sharing less DNA. And hopefully that the fact that they share less DNA means that they're descending from a more distant ancestor. So because they're an unknown match, you might get lucky, you might not. But I think it's good to choose somebody who has a tree, a big tree, but you still can't find a common ancestor. So they're an unknown match with a tree and no common ancestral couple in the tree that you can see. So for example, if you're looking for if you're looking for like a fourth great grandparent who's unknown, so you know your third great grandparent, but you need to find their parents, you're going to be looking for about fifth cousins. Some will be fourth cousins once removed, some will be fifth cousins, some will be half fifth cousins, about that range. So if we focus on fifth cousins, they share on average about 25 centimorgans, but they could share a range of 0 to 117 centimorgans based on the shared centimorgan project. But that's such a big range. We want to use a more common range. So what is a common range for someone sharing fourth great grandparents? And that would be maybe using the standard deviation of 18, adding that and subtracting that from the average to get a more tight range. So maybe a range of 7 to 43 centimorgans for what an average fifth cousin might share, which would be plus or minus 1 standard deviation from the average. So if we look for a cousin that's in that range, when we're looking for a fourth great grandparent, then maybe we will find a good unknown match who has a tree that we can't find a common ancestor in to use for our unknown cluster. So let's look, and I always like to choose somebody who has on the side of more shared DNA than less, because if they share a little more on the upper end, then they're going to have more shared matches. And the more shared matches a person has, the more people will be in a cluster and the better the cluster results will be, because you'll have more people and more trees, hopefully. So let's do this with an example. So here's a match, Maud's daughter. I know who she is. She descends from my research subject, Bathsheba Tharp, and she's shared her matches with me. And so she's one of my test takers. And I looked in her DNA matches and found a match who descends from the same ancestor, Joe. So Joe descends from Bathsheba Tharp, and Maud is my test taker who descends from Bathsheba Tharp. And the goal is to find parents of Bathsheba Tharp. So this would be Maud's mother, grandmother, great grandmother, second great grandmother, or sorry, Maud's daughter, second great grandmother, and making these two third cousins. So we're looking for a third great grandparent. So we could use a similar type of range to the one I was just talking about, and maybe find somebody who's in the 40s or 50s, sharing 40 to 50 centimorgans. So if we were to use Joe as our match of interest for the clusters, he shares 130 centimorgans and he's a third cousin. So he's a known match. We know how he descends from Bathsheba Tharp. Let's say I verified these parent-child relationships and I'm comfortable that I know who he is. What kind of clusters will we get using Joe as our match of interest? So I did that and I used Joe and I created custom clusters just with him, not with any sidekick matches, just Joe as the match of interest. I chose the range of 20 to, actually, I think I did 50, not 60, 20 to 50 centimorgans. And these are the clusters I got. So the first three clusters, 3 matches, 4 matches, and 9 matches, there weren't that many people with trees in there. And what's interesting about the custom clusters is that cluster 1 and cluster 2 are mostly the same, just with 1 more match added here. And then cluster 3 is the same as cluster 4, but with 5 more matches. So, and then cluster 4, this fourth cluster is the same, just with a few more added. So these matches are repeated in all of the little clusters. So I tend to skip those, especially if there's not many trees, and just go to like the third or the fourth cluster to analyze first. So starting with the one with 14 matches, let's analyze each cluster and see who the common ancestors are. So here are the 4 clusters. I took screenshots of each one and pasted them here. And the first one, when I looked at all the trees of the people who had trees, most of them descend from Bathsheba Tharp and her husband, John Robert Dyer. So those are the ancestors of most of them. And that's also the known ancestor in my research question. So this is basically a known cluster where these people all descend from a known ancestral couple that I've documented. So that's good. Maybe this next one will have more, more distant ancestors. So no, it didn't. It had more descendants of Bathsheba Tharp and John Robert Dyer. It had one interesting match, only one, which isn't really that helpful because in pedigree triangulation, you're looking for at least 3 or more that descend from the same, but potentially on Bathsheba Tharp's mother's side, who I've hypothesized is Joanna West, but only one match. So let's go to the next cluster. Maybe this one will have some more since there's so many little subclusters within it. And this one did have some interesting things. It had a lot of Dyer Tharp descendants, but then it had that one West match and a few descendants of Taylors, who could be John Robert Dyer's mother, and some Smiths, which could just be that's a common surname. But I wasn't able to really figure out a common ancestor for this cluster or any of these subclusters beyond Taylor. There were definitely a bunch of Taylors kind of in this middle cluster. So Taylor was probably on Dyer's side. So this isn't going to help us with Bathsheba Tharp's mother or father. But that one West match is still helpful. It's just we want more than one. And then going back to this one, we had several ancestral couples that were able to be identified. We had an interesting regression back to a more closer ancestral couple, which is Bathsheba Tharp's daughter, Elizabeth Dyer, who married a Beals. So 3 or 4 matches descending from that couple. Then some more matches from Bathsheba Tharp and her husband, John Robert Dyer. Then going back on Bathsheba's father's side, we have several matches descending from Lewis Tharp and his 2 wives, Joanna West and Judy Vernon. And then going back on the Dyer side, we had some matches who belong to this group I've identified as the Dyers of Granger County, Tennessee. So really no luck on Bathsheba Tharp's mother, except for this one West match and a couple other random matches. So as I tried to do pedigree triangulation, nothing was coming together to say, okay, these are all the descendants of this ancestral couple. And actually you can kind of tell just by the look of these clusters, because, for example, this cluster here, it's all kind of sparse, the matching. And you can see a lot of subclusters. So within each of these little subclusters, you might expect to see maybe an ancestral couple coming forward. And I did notice that with this cluster was mostly the Dyer Tharp descendants. And this one tended to be more the Taylors. But where what I really would like to see is a cluster that looks a little more like this purple one, where all of the people descend from a more distant ancestral couple. And that's what I was kind of hoping to find. So this one was disappointing. But we did use a known match. So let's try the idea of using a more distant unknown match. So instead of Joe, who descends from Bathsheba Tharp, let's choose one of his shared matches, looking for fourth or fifth cousins. So focusing on somebody who shares about 43 centimorgans and someone with a big tree whose ancestors aren't obviously Bathsheba Tharp, John Robert Dyer, some other Dyers, and Lewis Tharp's ancestry, really, so we can narrow it down to someone who could be on the side of Bathsheba's mother. And as we're doing pedigree analysis of all these matches, it's pretty common to find somebody with a big tree where we can't find a common ancestor, especially when we're under 50 centimorgans. So it takes us back a little bit more distant to sometimes these more colonial ancestors or more distant. So looking at Joe's shared matches, that helps us to be on the right line of the family because Joe is a descendant of our research subject, Bathsheba Tharp. And so we can see, here's a shared match who's a descendant of Dyer Tharp. You can see the common ancestor hint. And then here's somebody with an unlinked tree, and then another Dyer Tharp descendant. And then here's someone who's sharing 49 with the tree that's not unlinked. So maybe Raina would be a good person to start with for our next cluster analysis. So I chose Raina and I did look at her tree. I should have put a screenshot here, but basically it's a very large filled out tree. There's not any missing ancestors in all of the first 4 or 5 generations. So she was a good choice. I didn't see any overlap with known surnames. So with her clusters, I wish they were numbered. I numbered these myself. They're colors and they tell you how many matches are in each, but I wish they had numbers. That would be nice for talking about them. So I gave the first one, cluster 1 is orange with 3 matches, and this one was too small to be meaningful. And the same with cluster 2 with only 4 matches, same as this one, +1, too small to be meaningful. Cluster 3 was 7 matches. This one was a little bit interesting. There was one descendant of Bathsheba Tharp in that cluster, and then 2 people with trees that had surname Arnold. And so that was interesting. And then 2 people with no tree or too small, and then a couple with just no obvious connections. So going to cluster 4, there were 9 matches. So 3 of them were the same as this cluster 3, but there were 6 new matches. And 4 of them had small trees. And then 4 of them had the Compton surname. And then building the Compton trees back gave me an ancestral couple of Milton Compton and Elizabeth Bragg. And so I'm going to put Elizabeth Compton Bragg here. So then going back, and I could have put Milton Compton and Elizabeth Bragg, but you'll see why I chose that one. So then cluster 5, that had 25 matches. So that was a really good one to do pedigree analysis on because there were a lot of people to choose from. I opened up all the trees and found a lot of Bragg descendants. So the hypothesis I have now is that Elizabeth Compton Bragg is probably a daughter or descendant of Ruth Arnold Bragg, who was one of the ancestors in the common ancestral couple here. And do you see how tightly all of these people match each other? This is such a good, strong cluster. These people are all matching each other. And while sometimes this kind of strong matching can indicate a population segment where you can't find a common ancestor in a genealogical time frame, but they all seem to really match each other a lot. That could be like a pile-up segment, a pile-up region or population segment. In this case, it wasn't that. It was that they are all descendants of Ruth, and she had a ton of descendants in Georgia, and a lot of them have tested. And she was kind of a colonial ancestor, so she just has a lot of descendants. And then going back to the sixth cluster, also pretty heavy matching right here. And you can see there's a little cluster, like a subcluster at the top that overlaps with some of these people, but these people all really overlap with each other. And as I opened up the trees of these and looked at all the trees, it was obvious that this was Ruth's parents, Humphrey Arnold and Anne. And so if I didn't already know about this line, because I chose a line on purpose that I'd already researched, so it'd be easier for me to see the common ancestors. If I hadn't already known this, it would have been really exciting to see these unknown clusters. Before I did a research project on Bathsheba Tharp's mother, I didn't know about these Comptons, the Braggs, and the Arnolds. But it was pretty clear because of the repeated surnames in every tree. It became clear pretty quickly that this was the Arnold cluster and this was the Bragg cluster. And the way that Ancestry Custom Clusters works is that it walks the clusters back so nicely that you can almost see an exact line of descent, just like I've showed here. And it was interesting to see a couple Arnold matches right in this cluster. Sometimes you just get somebody who shares an extra amount of DNA with your test taker more than than you would expect for the distance of the relationship. But most people fall into this nice further back, walking the clusters back. All right. So the takeaways from this little experiment with the custom clusters is that when I ran a custom cluster analysis using a known match who descended from Bathsheba Tharp, the clusters ended up mostly being descendants of the known research subject or different lines, kind of all mixed in. But when I changed the match of interest for a new custom cluster analysis to an unknown match who was more distant, then I got some more distant clusters that were focused on her. And so Raina happens to be a descendant of Humphrey Arnold. So I just happened to get lucky. But if you don't get lucky with your first try to get the clusters you want, just try another person who has a big tree and none of them are matching what you're looking for. So these unknown match clusters can be really informative, but we might have to try many times to get the ones we're looking for. So it only takes about a minute to run a cluster, just choosing one unknown match, run a cluster for them and see what you find out. And for fourth to sixth great grandparents, you're going to want to use these more distant matches. So from about 40 to 60 centimorgans. And probably using a range going down to 20 centimorgans, since that's the lower threshold that you're allowed to use right now for Ancestry custom clusters. If you go down to 20 centimorgans, that brings in more of those distant matches. And then a range of 20 to 50 seemed to work pretty well for what I was doing, but for yours, you might need to adjust that depending on the number of matches you have. So I hope that was helpful thinking about custom clusters using a match of interest who is someone you haven't figured out yet, an unknown match. Are there any comments or questions about that?
Well, I have a question. Maybe you said this, but I just want to clarify. So when you find your match of interest, do you just run a cluster for that person without any sidekick matches?
Yeah, good question. I didn't really say that explicitly, but no, I haven't been using sidekicks for this experiment and it worked really well. So that's why I
Okay.
wanted to choose a cluster that I already knew. So with this one, so I found these clusters using a network graph originally a few years ago. And so I knew that this particular test taker had a lot of Humphrey Arnold descendants. So I was trying to see if I could replicate finding these clusters with Ancestry custom clusters rather than a network graph. And so I was really pleased to find that, and it wasn't too difficult. And I just used a shared match of a known Bathsheba descendant who was sharing less than him. So he was sharing 100, she was sharing 40. So that would kind of indicate a further back generation, although it could sometimes mean just somebody who inherited less from Bathsheba. So you never know. But looking at her tree and not seeing any, Bathsheba, Tharp, or John Robert Dyer relatives in there helped. And so with no sidekick matches and with just Reina as the match of interest, these are the clusters that I got.
Mhm. I think a good takeaway from this is to try this on some clusters you've already figured out so that you can start understanding how it works. I think that was probably really helpful for you because you already
Yeah.
knew these clusters. So
Yes. I think
I,
sometimes we go straight to wanting to
mhm,
figure out our brick wall, and it makes it a lot harder to understand the tool and how it's working.
mhm. Yeah. Yes, so I love that. And, I'll also just point out the more you have identified your people, the better, because once these custom clusters are generated, when you look at that person and you have a note attached about who they are, then that can really help you to figure out who the cluster is. So the more we keep identifying people, it will really help.
Yeah. And another thing I really used with this analysis to make it go faster were the common ancestor hints.
Hmm.
So if you have a hypothesis for who the ancestral line is, if you put that in your tree and then, you know, do this after the common ancestor hints have populated from that new addition to your tree, then you'll have a lot more help. And so because I already had put Humphrey Arnold in the tree, a bunch of these were common ancestor hints.
Aha. That is but you had a really good hypothesis for him
Right.
before you put him
Yeah.
in. Yeah.
And it had
Yeah.
my hypothesis had come from the network graph.
Mm.
But if I would have just seen this without it, I could have opened up all the trees and started,
Hmm.
and I'll show that a little later today, how to do pedigree analysis when you don't have a hypothesis and you don't know who the common ancestor might be. But you can just start looking at the surnames in the trees and looking for overlaps.